Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. It's great to have you all here on this Friday night. Tonight is the third and final event in a collaboration between Brooklyn Public Library and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Clemente Soto Vélez Cultural and Education Center. This series celebrates the publication of this landmark anthology, Latino Poetry, the Library of America Anthology. And we have it at our shop if you're interested in flipping through it and purchasing it. And tonight is dedicated to exploring the poets whose work has shaped today's thriving Latino poetic tradition. Before I get more into the program tonight, I just want to say a word about the Center for Brooklyn History. We are, as you know, a beautiful landmark building here, built in 1881, and formerly the Brooklyn Historical Society, and we have programs of all kinds, education programs of all kinds, but truly, you know, the heart of this institution is our special collections, and we now are the proud steward of the most extensive collections related to Brooklyn and Brooklyn history in the world. This includes a groundbreaking Puerto Rican oral history collection, the first of its kind, initiated by the then Brooklyn Historical Society 50 years ago in 1973. Over 80 interviews were conducted in the early 1970s, codifying the voices of members of the Puerto Rican community who arrived in Brooklyn between 1917 and 1945. It's one of our proud holdings. So back to tonight, we're honored to be co-presenting, as I mentioned, with the Clemente Center. And to tell us a little bit more about their work and the multi-year initiative Historias, I'm very delighted to introduce Libertad O. Guerra, Executive Director and the Chief Curator of Historias. Please help me welcome Libertad.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and so grateful to be in community tonight after what we've all lived recently. So, founded in 1993, the Clemente Soto Vélez Cultural and Educational Center. It's worth saying the full name so people don't confuse Clemente for another Clemente. It's a Puerto Rican Latinx multi-arts institution with an inclusive international vision rooted in New York City's Lower East Side, or Loisaida. A mainstay of Lower Manhattan, that Clemente has been pivotal in pluralizing access to independent cultural producers for 30 years now, engaging diverse audiences in heritage preservation, neighborhood history, and cutting-edge multicultural experimentation that emphasizes the humanities' role in bridging civic and cultural life. This fall, we are very proud to have recently launched a 3-year Historias initiative, which aims to highlight how New York City has benefited from the experimental and constructivist spirit of its largest immigrant group, Latinos, whose contributions are often erased or tokenized in mainstream narratives, even though they represent 1/3 of the city's population. 1/3. So we will address this by weaving together stories essential to the city's fabric beyond surface-level representation, and by creating a framework that allows for the multi-positionality of Latino experiences to be seen and understood in their intersecting nuances. This approach also allows us to see New York City itself in a new light. In this way, Historias is more than just an initiative. It is a movement to reclaim space, both physical and symbolic, and to rescue and amplify stories that have shaped the city's evolution and contributed to the ongoing struggle for the right to the city. So please learn more about the initiative, the 3-year, how we plan to use culture and artist commissions to translate a lot of these fact-based histories, and learn more about the different thematic tracks of how we're going to organize this rich history of Latinos making of New York and rehistoricizing the city itself. One of the thematic tracks that Historias tackles is everyday poetics, ritual, and resistance. And that's here what we're here today representing as part of that through this partnership with the LOA, Library of America, and with the third of our 3 partnership events that we did with the Brooklyn Public Library System. That thematic track explores the role of Latino poets have played as a vital role in shaping diasporic identity, institution building, and community organizing. The work of New York poets such as José Martí, Salomón de la Selva, Julia de Burgos, Lourdes Casal, and Clemente Soto Vélez himself has shaped today's thriving Latino poetic tradition and our understanding of what it means to be American. These revolutionary voices represent a range of Latin American geographies and aesthetics, including themes of migration, anti-imperialism, latinidad, language, and exile. So welcome. I'm so proud to be partnering again with these 3 institutions. Hopefully the first of many. We aim to also explore collaborations in what Marcia mentioned about the Puerto Rico's archive that they have through the Historias platform as well. And I leave you with our esteemed poets and scholars for this enticing panel that will also be capped with an experimental chorus performance that blends together poems from the anthology as well as with the ancestors that will be discussed in the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Libertad. So as Libertad mentioned, there are 2 parts to the evening. We are going to start with a conversation between scholars and experts, and then there'll be a brief resetting of the stage, followed with a very special experimental performance by the Poets Choir, conducted by Edwin Torres. So let me tell you a little bit about the experts and folks who are going to talk in the moderated conversation, and then I'll invite them all to join on the stage. Laura Lomas teaches Comparative American Studies, Latine Literature and Culture, Ethnic and Immigrant Literature of the United States and the Americas, Women's Writing, 19th Century Studies, and Feminist and Decolonial Theory in the English Department in the Graduate Program in American Studies at Rutgers University in Newark. She is author of Translating Empire, José Martí, Migrant Latino Subjects and American Modernities, which received the Modern Language Association's Prize for Best Book in Chicano and Chicana and Latino and Latina Studies. She also co-edited the Cambridge History of Latine American Literature and co-founded the Latine Studies Working Group and the Immigrant Rights Collection. Urayoán Noel is a 2022 Letras Boricuas Fellow and the author of 8 books of poetry, most recently Transversal. It's a New York Public Library Book of the Year. Other works include the LAFTA award-winning study Invisible Movement, New Yorkan Poetry from the 60s to Slam, the durational performance Woki Toki Teki, and as translator, Adjacent Islands by Nicole Cecilia Delgado. Noel lives in the Bronx and teaches at NYU. And finally, our moderator tonight, Edwin Torres, is a New York City native and editor of The Body in Language, an anthology. His poetry collections include Conundrum, I Will Be Your Many-Angled Things, Xoitziox, The Infinite World Word Object, and Ameriscopia. Multidisciplinary collaborations with a wide range of cultural nomads have contributed to the development of his body lingo poetics. He is currently an adjunct poetry professor at Columbia University. Please help me welcome all to the stage.
Hello? Okay.
Hello, hello.
Hello, welcome. Thank you all for coming here. I am going to start with a very brief prepared statement, and then we'll turn the panel over to the panelists. So I was looking at this really beautiful anthology, and I've always questioned, what is Latino poetry? In my own work, how much of my Latino-ness is in my poetry? So I wrote about that a little bit. Okay. So I want to note how anthologies situate the subject through chapter headings, so as to present a sense of finding the rubric needed for today's quest. The chapter headings here: antecedents, corridos and nostalgia songs, Latino ancestors, let me tell you what a poem brings, howling as they came, my body sang its undeath. So they all connect to the introduction, beautiful and thoroughly unearthed by the editor Rigoberto Gonzalez. He calls the introduction, places we call home. So home is what I fixated on. He addresses a defining characteristic of Latino poetry as finding home, what home means to someone who has lost theirs. Home in metaphor, in community spaces, public performance, in language, in solitude. Then there's home as solace for the in-between space, claimed by the traveler, the ethnic, the not from here, the looking to fit in, emblems of our Latino commonality with those who live on the fringe, the artist, looking to find harbor beyond their chosen border. Today we're addressing that definition, that distinction around Latino poets in New York City specifically, referencing an enduring legacy of migration and exile. Identity is a precursor to inspiration. Loss, movement, discovery. Finding self allows other selves to emerge when life is in constant flux, between territories, between identities. The multiplicity of the city presents a body to come back to for voices that feel outside belonging. As the Dominican poet Rina Espaillat writes, the gringo tongue that translates you. Trying to define the Latino, what I am, circles language as creator, body as nation, which I then circle back to imagination. Mariposa says, Puerto Rico nació en mí, while Miguel Piñero says, I don't want to be buried in PR. As poets, we have many birthings to become many selves. We adventure into code switching as a labyrinth that creates many birthings. That question of where to land has fueled my own poetics. I want to live in a liminal center. I want to live in the limitless enter, redefining my Puerto Ricanness as a limitless harbor. As the anthology states, poetry enacts an antidote to silence and invisibility, propelling isolation beyond its weight into transformative breath, a sense of othering that can be achieved if the poet allows the poem its home. Bringing in many homes, including street and history, locations for place which were previously unexisting, homes are unrealized, equaling the body as ghetto. Which brings us to the political space. Lorna D. Cervantes writes, these bullets bury deeper than logic. Racism is not intellectual. I cannot reason these scars away. Outside my door, there is a real enemy who hates me. Bringing us out of island splendor into urban conflict. To speak not from trauma of misunderstood identity, but affection for multi-identity. In other words, I am not what you expect, I am more. This is a common trope among the disenfranchised, to seek acceptance or to display its lack, i.e., I am enough for me. But to accept enough for me doesn't seem very Latino. We want more. Or maybe we just want to be heard. Stephanie Soltree Kamba writes, I don't think that places are my home, but people are. An enduring comment on location and what home can mean. I want to leave it there. There's more that I wrote, but I think, and I have questions afterwards, but I want to turn it over to our panelists to discuss the idea of Latino in poetry and your entry to the anthology and to Latino poetry in New York City specifically. So Urayoán, Laura, I turn it over.
Well, thank you, Edwin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thanks to Library of America and to Rigoberto for this incredible anthology. I mean, maybe start there, thinking also of Library of America. Like, this is one of the most prestigious, right, but also one of the most canonical, as it were, presses, right? And so on the one hand, we could say, wow, Latinos now have a Library of America anthology. How fantastic, right? But what does it mean to be of America, right? And I think even just of US America, beyond, right, the hemispheric Americas. And so that's a question that I think I was talking to Laura about. And maybe one way to frame that, right, is in terms of what is, right, latinidad, right? And latinidad is a kind of, it's not even an ethnicity, it's a pan-ethnic formation, right, rooted in a kind of imperial history of the U.S., right, occupation, right, of you know, what we call Latin America. And so thinking of the Monroe Doctrine, right? And basically telling everybody else in Europe, hey, hands off on these countries to the south of us, they belong to us, right? So even entering, right, into the question of Latinidad is entering into these histories of empire, and I think Laura can speak to that, having written a fantastic book on the topic. One thing I could say just as a poet myself is thinking about what Latino studies or Latinx studies is as a field, and ethnic studies more generally, and how different that is from Latin American studies. So I did my PhD at NYU, right? Very much in Latin American studies, which is a field with a strong, like, Cold War history. Basically, the US was worried about protecting its interest in Latin America, right? So I think it you know, paid for all these specialists to protect those interests. So it has a very conservative history up through about the 1990s, right? And then somehow in grad school, I had to become a Latinx studies scholar, right? Become an ethnic studies scholar. An ethnic studies scholarship, right? Whether it's Black studies or Chicanx studies, right? Asian American studies is rooted in the lived experience of the people and the communities, right? And exists not because, right, the state decided it should to protect its interests, but because communities that were shut out historically from academia, right, demanded the right to know their history, to know their languages, to know their culture, right, and that gave us, right, the first Puerto Rican and Latino studies programs and Mexican American studies programs. So the sense that in a real way, right, when we call something Latino as opposed to Latin American, we're thinking about the lived experience, right, of people who maybe have a 400-year history, right, on the Mexico-US border because the border crossed us and we didn't cross the border, as is often put it. Or people who have histories in New York since the 19th century, right, or people who got here yesterday, right? Somehow it's about the very different bodies, and that extends to questions of race and gender and sexuality and citizenship status, and I think we've tried to, Rigoberto did a great job of honoring, right, the complexity of all those identities and all those modes of situatedness in the anthology. So I think for me, you know, Latino poetry as a poet, right, is very much those questions that you're asking, Edwin, about who am I and how do I relate, right, to this continuum as someone coming from Puerto Rico and coming to you from the Bronx and thinking about those different geographies, but then also as a professor thinking, okay, what does it mean to do work as a professor of ethnic studies, right, and to have that privilege, right, to do what other poets did for me. That'll be the final point that I make is poets in a Latino context aren't just poets, they are institution builders. Libertad alluded to that in the introduction. We're lucky to be here on behalf. I'm also on the board of the Clemente as the resident poet, and Clemente Soto Vélez was a great poet and political activist who basically was such a troublemaker, they told him, don't come back to Puerto Rico. So he ends up in New York organizing, right, all these communities. And so in a very real way, right, poets are institution builders, they're program builders, and many of the first programs in ethnic studies, right, were founded by poets. You could think of somebody like, you know, Amir Baraka in a Black arts context, right, doing analogous work. So just that would be a way of thinking about Latino poetry. It's not just the product of a creative act, but it's maybe a documentation of a creative way of living, right, under these like oppressive systems, right, and claiming a vision of knowledge, right, that isn't just literary, right, that's connected to all the ways in which we live and we define home. And there's not one home, there's many homes because there's many different identities and bodies involved, right, in that category of Latino poetry.
Just real quickly on that note, because you're from PR, you came to New York, so I was born in the Bronx, and in a way I came to Puerto Rico from the Bronx. So that sense of like this inner migration, and as I mentioned to you before, there were poets in here that I didn't know about that are like, oh, that's why I write the way I do.
Yeah.
And you sometimes don't know your own antecedents until they're facing you, or else you sort of embody them without knowing that. And then as you travel through that embodiment, you find out who you are. And that's another sense of home, almost.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this really resonates. I do want to say it is so exciting to be here in this space live and direct, and to be with Urayoán and to meet Edwin, and to be part of this Historias project, which actually is set right in my neighborhood. I live in Loisaida, and I have since the 90s. It was sort of where I hung out, and I always dreamed I'd be able to live. So a dream has come true. And also because this is a project about claiming space. And I really want to honor that point that you just made about poets as institution builders. I'm a scholar. I teach in an English department, and I do not have the luxury of being a contributor to a Latinx studies program because we don't have one yet. But I do want to note that that is not because there has not been a history of struggle at Rutgers. I teach at Rutgers University-Newark, the most diverse campus in the United States for the past 20 years. And we are a Hispanic-serving institution, but we somehow did not get the program in Latino studies. But we do have a program in New Brunswick. I have amazing colleagues there, and a minor has finally come into being, and that's an exciting opening. So I want to talk about a couple of historical nodes, but I do want to, and among those nodes, at each juncture, the point that you made is true. So I spent a lot of years working on José Martí, who was a Cuban. He's known primarily, maybe if you go to Havana, you land in the airport named after him, you go to the library, little kids come up to you and start reciting his poetry. I mean, and I actually, when I did, the Cubans were like, why are you writing on José Martí? Like, we're empty here with José Martí. But in the United States, he's not that well known. I mean, one of the places where he worked on Front Street, you know, it's kind of an abandoned site, and a lot of people, Martí scholars, have been fighting. Esther Allen, his translator, has been fighting to get the city to recognize that space where Martí worked, he translated, and he always not only was an activist to kind of help make the idea of Latin America come into being by decolonizing his island and also collaborating with Puerto Ricans, very important, other poets like Pachimarín, and others, a huge community of people who all were fighting to have the possibility of Cuba and Puerto Rico as independent islas. And so that was an example of the poet as institution builder, and really also staking a claim to America. I mean, in fact, Martí's most famous essay, José Martí published an essay that he gave first as a lecture up on like 158th Street. Well, now that's the institution, the society, the Sociedad de Hispanoamericana de Nueva York. They published many journals, La Revista Ilustrada de Nueva York. That's where Our America, Nuestra America, was first published. And all of that was about trying to create a space where to create a space to call home. And it all happened, it started here, right in New York. So it's about honoring that struggle. Now, that was in the 1880s and 1890s. Jump to the next node, the 1940s and 1950s with Operation Bootstrap, when the greatest Puerto Rican poet comes to live, well, among many others, company included, Julia de Burgos comes to New York, and she begins to write poems, even in English. So I went to Roosevelt Island where she was writing some of these poems, and I was like, where are the traces? Where is the plaque? Where is the commemoration of Julio de Burgos on Roosevelt Island? And I mean, I published something hoping that we could cite that and go to the people running Roosevelt Island and kind of demand some space there, because that is, she's such a towering poet because of her invention and a great contributor to the field of Latino poetry. I mean, I keep thinking about people who are not included, like Pachi Marin. I'm thinking about contemporary Brazilian poets, undocu poet Aline Melio. She has a poem that kind of alludes to Julio de Burgos. She has a poem to Aline Resende Melio, sort of acknowledging the influence of Julio de Burgos on her own poetry. So that's the 1940s, 1950s. And then we leap up to that really rich period of after the 60s, 1973, which was cited, and even the 1980s, when some of the people that I'm thinking about right now, I mean, you mentioned, again, institution builders who founded Latino studies at Rutgers. A lot of people at Rutgers don't even know his name, and he's not in the volume. He was a brilliant poet, and his name is, he actually changed his name, like Julio de Burgos, Victor Fernandez Fragoso. And so what's exciting about our research in the field, the work that we do, I'm also part of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project, is that this field is so exciting because it's constantly changing. And I mean, it was so emotional to read this and see Lourdes Casal. I mean, she's another figure. Let me just say a few things about Lourdes Casal. She actually was on the faculty at Rutgers University-Newark. There's like a university, Rutgers University-Newark vibe with this volume. I mean, my colleague, Rigoberto Gonzalez, he edited it. Lourdes Casal is in the volume. And not many people remember that she was our colleague, right? And it was really thanks to anthologies, the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature, that Casal continued to kind of figure in the anthologies. But then one time, Francis Negron Montaner and Yolanda Martinez San Miguel, they had students who asked them, like, who is this Anna Velford person? And they asked the question in Cuba, and Luisa Campuzano said, like, I know who she is, she's living in New York. And so that's one of her most famous poems, the poem that's included here. And, you know, she's living there like on 75th Street, and she has this huge story to tell. And I mean, sadly, unlike Martí, who has this huge archive in Havana, because he's sort of part of the state apparatus there, Lourdes Casal's archive is kind of scattered to the winds. And so, I mean, part of the project is to really even just publish an anthology of her writings, because she also published, like Fragoso, in English and in Spanish. So that's another really important part. I mean, for me, I kind of came to this work as a translator. I was translating for the Comité de Madres de los Desaparecidos. I became fluent in Spanish, and I had to reconceptualize my understanding of the United States. Thank you for mentioning empire. I mean, we can talk about home, but we also have to think about displacement and the struggle for spaces that may be different from or within or under the radar of the nation.
Which goes to one question I have about connection, the sense of connection, and how that can illuminate belonging. What is it about connection that makes belonging possible or not possible? Maybe specifically, I guess in poetry in general, but specifically to New York City Latino poets.
Well, I mean, yeah, I want you to jump into this question, but I mean, for me, language is a huge connection. And I think, you know, part of the anxiety, I mean, part of also what I love about this event, thank you for organizing it, is that we are in this commemoration of this tradition and the recognizing of Latinidad as a power, as 1/3 of New York City. We're really interrogating a narrative that has come from our elected officials, kind of blaming immigrants and criminalizing immigrants, especially Latino immigrants, brown immigrants, instead of recognizing the power that immigrants bring. They make it possible. Like, you cannot eat in a restaurant in New York City without those immigrants' work. And then we have all the culture that comes with it because people have set their roots here. So I think, like, for me, it's language. It's like, how do we talk to each other in Spanish? I mean, that's how you talk to the people who are doing the construction work, maybe the people who are helping to take care of your kids. And I mean, I know I'm indebted to Sara Vasquez for helping take care of my kids. So it's a lingua franca that's unrecognized to a certain
There's
extent.
also what I equate that to is there's a fracture to the body that can happen when different parts of yourself are not talking to themselves. Like when you're not a whole body, let's say, you're not as pure in your search as you can be. So equate that to a people or a genealogy. Like the fractured selves is also the fractured selves. You know, all that. That's my own poetic whatever.
I mean, well, I mean, I did want to just conclude by mentioning Ansaldúa. We think of Ansaldúa as someone who introduces the concept of the border, and especially thinking about the border as a metaphor for linguistic difference, for sexual difference, racial difference. But she also started talking about multiple selves. And I think part of like this recognition, this kind of celebration of how Latino communities have transformed New York is to recognize all these concepts that often we don't give credit where credit is due for, including this idea of like innovating how we think about being multiple people, the fact that we say they, them now.
Right.
Yeah, I think obviously just poetry is a kind of connectedness, right? So if you think of one definition you could give for poetic language versus ordinary language, right? As ordinary language relies on familiar connections, right? Whereas poetry may be for just new connections, right? Which are based on metaphors or, you know, imagined associations, right? Or just experiments with language. And there's a sense of possibility, which I think your work embodies, and we'll see in the performance in a second. So I also think that reading each other is a way to forge those connections, and something I try to stress in the classroom. And one of the things that's really beautiful about this anthology is to see poets reading each other, especially to see the younger, quote unquote, poets read the ancestors, right? The way they need to. So in a way, I want to say it's about connection, but it's about disconnection, maybe. It's about reading, but it's about misreading. It's about honoring, but it's also about betraying, right? Strategically.
Sort of honoring your own sense of belonging, whatever that means.
Absolutely. I can think of one example, right? Someone who's in the anthology who always, I don't know, I don't, you know, like hate watching, when you watch something you're like, this is terrible, but I can't stop. I hate read William Carlos Williams. And I love his work, but there's something about it that's just like, it's amazing and it's, you know, ick at the same time, right? And I think also maybe it's too close, the whole like, you know, half Anglo, half Boricua mom, it you know, hits too close to home, right? So there's that. But also just the fact that, you know, Williams is so like canonized within this Anglo-American, you know, context. And the fact that I think part of what, say, a poet like Victor Hernandez Cruz does, you know, a Nuyorican icon, right? In writing from Williams, is he leads us to all the weirdest, most random moments in Williams. So all the most like Spanglishy, syncopated, like street, right? The least respectable aspects of Williams's poetry, which are not the Red Wheelbarrow and all those poems that, you know, you're taught to hate in school, right? They're these weird, experimental, translingual poets. So there's Victor finding a kind of ancestor for his own incredibly radical and influential, right, translingual experiments, which influence, I think, both of us. I mean,
his Caribbean into the city.
Absolutely. So
totally,
I think he recovers Williams's Caribbeanness, right? Whose mom was Puerto Rican and whose dad was raised in the DR, right? So there's a sense that the Williams you're going to get here is not the Williams you would get in a regular plain old vanilla anthology of American poetry, right? So it's giving us a different Williams. But then I'm also thinking of someone like Salomón de la Selva, right? Who will remix in a second, right? So this Nicaraguan poet who has this reception as a minor poet in Nicaragua, or maybe a major poet in Nicaragua, but a minor poet in the Latin American canon. And then he ends up in New York publishing in Poetry Magazine in the 1910s and puts out a book called Tropical Town in English, but then he's taking like Spanish lullabies or sing-songs and like translating them into English. So, you know, thinking of like Julia self-translating. So just that strategy of poets like maybe betraying a certain Spanish that you know, the Academy expected, right? And imagining, right, these borderlands between English and Spanish, reflecting their life in the US, right? So Salomón de la Selva is kind of a footnote, right, within all these poetry traditions. But as Central American Latinx poetry becomes more and more visible, we're like, wow, here's Salomón de la Selva, and he's writing these seeming like sing-songs, but ooh, he's taking shots at Wall Street and he's taking a shot at empire. He can't help but think of like the history of Banana Republic in Central America and how that connects, right, to what it means to live in the U.S. in the shadow of World War I, right? So thinking of also the kind of geographies that poets bring with them, that's another sense of connectedness, right? So Julia brings her Rio Grande de Loíza and lets Mariposa imagine that Rio Grande de Loíza as the Bronx River, right? And so, this Central American poet, right, brings this sense of like how Central Americans' lands were occupied, right, and brings that to bear on his sense of what Anglo-American modernism is doing in the U.S. and writes some of the weirdest texts in that context. And now Central American poets can take that and say, let's flip it and do something fun with this, right? So again, reading, but not in the sense of always honoring. Sometimes we have to betray stuff. And I wanted to add then that it's not just about institution building. I use in my book on the Nuyorican the term counter-institution, right? Thinking of places like the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, the late Miguel Agarin, another Rutgers person and a mentor to many of us, right? As someone who, had a day job at Rutgers, that was the institution, although he's helped build some of those spaces as well. But the Nuyorican was this, like, again, this kind of liminal, kind of border space that created this counter tradition in U.S. literature, but was also outside of it, right? And so thinking of also the job, right, of forging those connections is making counter connections, right?
And it's also, so the other thing that you just mentioned makes me think like the lived experience that the Latino poets are trying to get over by leaving their home is sort of like framed as experimental writing. And what does experimentalism mean, to what we're writing about? The sense of the experimental being language-based or hybrid-based, as opposed to form or whatever it is. And in reality, it's not experimental. It's the body. It's the self kind of coming out for people to see. And sometimes that's too raw, too wild. But it's reality in a sense. And I think that there's a lot of experimentalism here that's not formally experimentalism, but it very much connects to that canon, that sense of what's right and what's wrong.
I love how you talked about the experimental coming out of a way of life, about cultural, all these different art forms that Latinos have contributed. Music, dance is always a part of the poetics. And I have to say that myself, because I primarily write essays, the explosion of the possibility of writing an academic essay that we owe to people. I mean, there's a prize now for Gloria Anzaldúa because she transformed what it's possible to do in an academic essay. You can incorporate poetry, you can incorporate testimonio, you can incorporate, and I think part of that too is, again, recognizing that this is a different field from Latin American studies. And a lot of my students, I teach in this, and they come and they're like, we don't get any of this history. No one is teaching us this. And even the prescriptions around what is taught often focuses on Latin American literature because it's more comfortable than talking about this sort of presence right here, right next door.
Yeah, I want to add just that that's an ongoing project, right? Because it's the story of our communities, right? So the same way, right, Algarín had to make up a Nuyorican Poets Cafe to find that counter-institutional space. I'm thinking one beautiful thing in the anthology toward the end, you see Rigoberto in the introduction making room for undocumented poets, and I'll leave Rigoberto to tell his own, right, migrant story, which he writes so beautifully about, and his queer migrant story, but also like trans poets, undocumented poets, right? Those are poets that they can't say, oh, here are my ancestors in this anthology. You have to kind of make up your own ancestors, right? Make them your own language and your own sense of poetic possibility. So that's that sense that it's really a breathing document, right? That I think is meant not to fossilize, right, these traditions, but to show us these many openings, right? And I think that extends into the geographies of the Latinidades here. I think there's an attempt to include, right, Central American poets and South American poets, and even just the variety of poets in New York, right, representing a range of traditions and histories.
Absolutely. I mean, I was thinking about that exciting moment when Cecilia Gentili, she's not a poet, but the fact that she, they had her funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was such another example of claiming space, and the church was freaking out. But it's also about all of those syncretic traditions, the presence of botanicas and santeria within our city that certainly informed, I think, the way that Tato Laviera lived, who was another person who I think he's one of the reasons why I'm here and why he helped me to kind of think of what I was going to write about in the book, because he wanted me to make that connection between these poets from the 1880s, José Martí, the great Cuban poet, and himself as a Nuyorican poet, hanging out in the same neighborhood if we just look back into the history.
Could I just ask, like, if Laura, if she could tell us...
That's not a very moderating thing. But go ahead, yes.
No, if you could tell us something about research, maybe end with that. It sounds boring, but I'm actually thinking of...
What's our time like? We have like 15, 20 minutes or so, or what?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to get...
I mean, I'm wondering, like, to give a sense for folks, like, how do you do this research? So you mentioned Tato La Viera, right? The fact that doing this kind of work isn't just like typical academic research where you put on your glasses and you find a dusty tome in an archive and you start working. Right. You really have to be part of a community. So I think we're also modeling community-based research. And it's hilarious being at NYU and the deans decide that they just discovered, right, public humanities or community-based learning. I'm like, well, what do you think ethnic studies is, right? And with the caveat, with the added, component that you're not mentored in it. Now we're training supposedly people in public humanities, but of course they don't mean ethnic studies, right? Because that's not seen as having the value, right? So thinking also about our current political moment, I think that's one of the powers of and the privileges of doing the work that I do, right, is having to challenge myself and say, okay, my work comes from communities. As the community changes, right, my approach and my methodology and my sense of who my interlocutors are has to evolve as well. So I'm wondering, I remember the great talk you gave on Ansaldúa and Borderlands as a kind of New York book, right? Yeah. So that sense that's you thinking from your own situatedness in New York, but it's also maybe opening a conversation, right, that maybe we weren't having 20 years ago, but that feels urgent now. So just talking about that, how does the contemporaneity of the work that we do?
Yes, I mean, well, it is so exciting to kind of find that a scholar that a lot of people are reading, but primarily think of as working on a completely different location. She was living in Sunset Park. She was in Brooklyn. She was like in West 4th Street, and she was writing about that. And you can find that when you go to the archives. She actually has this character named Prieta La Chuca. She's kind of like this punk rock with this huge mohawk, and she's writing lyrics for songs, and it's all happening like right in this neighborhood. So for me, I think I like your point about like counter-institution building, especially because Tato La Viera like recruits you. He recruited me. He was like, I need to come to Rutgers Newark. Like, I need to give a poetry workshop. And I think that really opened up the beginnings of our MFA program. I mean, it was before there was an MFA program. So it's this kind of constant changing. And then, I mean, I don't want to just say archive because I love archives. I love talking to people like Orlando Hernandez and Ostos, and but I think we need to talk to each other more. Like, this is really exciting to have this conversation.
Tato has an amazing poem here, like re-breaking we. It's a beautiful experimental thing. But it's also the sense of like going back a little bit about like Latino, like, hearing the polls that Latino men voted, blah, blah, blah. Like, am I not a Latino man? So like, it's hard to kind of place a specific identity on any one, let alone country. So it's interesting how to, like the key phrase in the cover is poetry, maybe more than Latino, because like poets or the opening that language or arts presents gives us an ability to sort of transform or to move between identities in that way. And that can expand where we're from, obviously, expand our home in a way. So I'm curious about that going back to the sense of the Latino-ness in what we're doing. I don't have a specific question. It's more just a thought.
Well, I'd like to shout you out. I mean, Edwin is so humble, right? But I remember there were two poets that I heard read, and I was like, WTF, right? That's Pedro Pietri and Edwin Torres, right? When I heard them, I'm like, drop everything. How does my own people's language sound that unfamiliar and like profoundly familiar at the same time, right?
The Bronx.
Absolutely. And so my sense is a lot of us who do this work, right, our mentors are people like Tato and Pedro, right, people who were themselves outside of the institution. Shout out to like the community-based scholars, right, so Juan Flores, right, whose work was foundational. I think the shadow, I don't know what I would have done at NYU without Juan Flores. Jose Esteban Munoz, right, in a very different way, not so much connected to poetry, but those were two people I worked with at NYU, who modeled some of that work. So there is a tradition there, this kind of community-engaged scholarship. But thinking of Juan and Tato, I remember, Juan would show up at the randomest places, kind of like my colleague Arlene Davila. There'll be this obscure art gallery event somewhere like in the Bronx, and I'll get there and say, this is so fresh, and they'll tell me, oh, you just missed Arlene. She left 10 minutes ago, right? So the sense that you really have to be where, right, these emerging, right, formations are, and kind of follow the artist. To me, that also makes this less boring. Right? I'm not working with a fixed canon. I'm like, who's going to show up and blow my mind the next time, right? Who's the 2024 version of Edwin for me that's gonna just like challenge me to start from scratch again and try to come up with a critical language that does justice to what they're doing. Yeah.
And isn't that because poetry has always been in these, like, think about the way it functions in the New York Poets Cafe. I mean, it's a performance, it calls people together. I mean, there's always drumming going on. I mean, and what I love about Fragoso, for example, he describes, I mean, my research right now is about poets who kind of published, they were both creative writers and they were also scholars in various fields, but they were writing in Spanish and English, and they were also from various different, it was a Cuban, a Puerto Rican, a Mexican-American, and the idea is they were all they were all friends. That was the other thing. So, I mean, you go in the address book of Fragoso, they're all there. Lourdes Casal is there, and it really began with that phrase in her poem, like, demasiado neoyorquina to be habanera, and demasiado habanera to be anything else. Yeah. So that there's a sense of also the city being a very specially generative space, because it was bringing all these people together to do these creative kind of transgressive things.
Yeah, I want to finish like a shout out to, because we were talking about him before, about the great Jesus Colon, right? Thinking of someone who's mainly known as a creative nonfiction writer, but also wrote poetry. And so Jesus Colon does these poetic vignettes or whatever, or creative nonfiction text, journalistic text. The boundaries are really porous, right? Where he's basically making fun of the chismes and the bochinches and the dysfunction within Latino communities. This is the 1920s, right? So first, the fact that we've been here a long time, and second, that it's never been as basic, right, or as simplistic as I think many of the narratives of both people that want to defend us and people that want to attack us, right, often arrive at this from a place of like, the simplistic, right? And I think one thing that literature always does is it complicates, right? Because it tells you a story from one person's vantage point that is reducible, and we have to engage with those differences that are also the linguistic differences in the text. So read like Jesus Colon, read all the people who, again, have been betraying, right, this sense of a kind of easy, unified, digestible, right, Latino identity or Latino poetry.
Tokenism is easier than thinking.
Absolutely.
So that's part of it. I think maybe that's it. Yeah. We're gonna do this conduction, this performance, and after the performance, we're gonna bring you guys back up, and we'll open the floor to questions. So a word about what we're going to do. The conduction that we're gonna perform now is taking a mode of composition created by the jazz musician Butch Morris, where he would conduct improvisational musicians through various hand gestures and create an on-the-spot composition. So he did this for many years. So I'm applying his principle to voice and text, and working with this anthology to kind of like see where the layering of language in a way evokes Latino poetry, but also evokes the city itself. So we'll do that, and after the performance, we'll speak again. So
should we name the poems that were?
Sure. Name the poem.
So what are we doing? We're doing.
Okay. We have 5 poets. Julia de Burgos.
Yeah.
It's
Lourdes Casal, because we mentioned her. Salomón de la Selva, and Clemente Soto Vélez, and
Martí. José Martí. Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry, it's in my head, but it isn't.
And just as an additional context, all these poets are presented as ancestors. That's the actual section in the anthology. So we thought this would be in a very New York, kind of botanica spirit, just like channel the ancestors, and let them take us where they want to take us. And of course, they will fight us because we are an instrument of those ancestors.
We're fightable. All right, thank you. We'll set this. Urayoán Noel, Lucian Berrios, E.J. McDonald, and McAdams, and Kristen Prevolet.
De Burgos. Ya las gentes murmuran que yo soy tu enemiga. Porque dicen
Already the people
verso,
murmur that
toda
I am
luna
your enemy
tuyo.
because they say
Mienten,
verse
that I mienten, Library de Burgos.
they lie.
La que se alza en mis versos, 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 la que se alza en mis
Human truth, you, honey, and source of hypocrisy, not me. In all my poems I address my heart. You are like your world, selfish, not me.
Who rises in my verses is not your voice. It is my voice, because you are the dressing and the essence is me. And the most profound abyss is spread between us. You are the cold doll of social lies, and me, the virile starburst of the human truth. You, honey of courtesans, hypocrisies, not me. In all my poems I address my heart.
You curl your hair and paint yourself, not me. The wind curls my hair, the sun paints me. You are a housewife, resigned, submissive, tied to the prejudices of men, not me. Unbridled, I am a runaway.
I came to know him, living like an H incarcerated in the honey of his bees. But the bars of honey were bittersweet, and because he lost himself in love with liberation, and because he did not abandon his love, nor she her lover, the earth for him is a hurricane of persecuted stars. Since liberation cannot love anyone except whoever loves the earth with its sun and sky.
Tú eres fría muñeca de mentira social,
porque la libertad no puede ser
vil
amante,
destello
sino de
de la
quien ama
humana
la tierra con
verdad.
su sol y su
Tú,
cielo.
miel de cortesanas,
Lo
hipocresía.
conocí viviendo
Yo no,
como una
que
H
en todos mis
encarcelada en la
poemas
miel de sus
desnudo
abejas.
el corazón.
Eran dulce amargo las
Tú eres como tu
por
mundo,
haberse enamorado
egoísta.
de la libertad
Yo no,
precisamente,
que en
y por
todo me lo
no
juego,
renunciar a su amor, y
hacer
ella
lo que
a su
soy
amor.
yo.
And
Tú eres
because he lost
la
himself,
grande señora, señorona.
and because he did not
Yo soy la
command
vida.
his love, nor she his love,
Y su cielo,
a hurricane of persecuted stars. Since liberation cannot love anyone except whoever loves the earth with its sun and sky. I came to know him, living like an H incarcerated in the honey of his bees.
But the bars of honey were bittersweet, and because he lost himself in love with liberation, and because he did not abandon his love, or she her lover, the earth for him is a hurricane of persecuted stars. Since liberation cannot love anyone
So,
except
this
whoever
poetry,
loves
it's here,
the sun
right now,
and sky.
happening
build, that would
Right in this room.
commandeer, that would
You can hear it.
tear down,
You
that
can
would
hear it in the
crash,
connection
just the
and the
key
community
that was the
and the
gentle
voices,
of my
the ancestors,
of soul.
the elders,
And all of that
speaking
is a helium
right now,
of
in
healing.
this moment. It's coming. It's coming.
And still New York is my home. 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 My home.
My home. My
And still
home.
New York is
My home.
I am ferociously loyal to this acquired patricia because of
home.
New York. I am a foreigner anywhere else.
My
Fierce
home.
pride in the
My
sense
home.
that assaults us along any West Side street. Marijuana and the smell of beer and the odor of dog urine and the savage vitality of Santana descending upon us from a speaker that thunders, improbably balanced on a fire escape, the raucous glory of New York in summer, Central Park and us, the poor who have inherited the lake of the North Side, and Harlem sails through the slackness of this sluggish afternoon. The bus slips lazily down along Fifth Avenue and facing me.
A song for Wall Street. In Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
In Nicaragua,
in Nicaragua,
my Nicaragua,
in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
In my
in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua,
In Nicaragua.
in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
My Nicaragua.
in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua,
my,
in Nicaragua,
What can you
in
buy
Nicaragua,
for a
in
penny?
Nicaragua,
What can you
in
buy?
Nicaragua,
What can
in
you
Nicaragua,
buy?
in
What can you
Nicaragua,
buy?
in
What
Nicaragua,
can you buy?
in Nicaragua,
What can you buy?
Nicaragua,
What can you
water
buy?
jug
Nicaragua,
What can
in
you
Nicaragua,
buy?
in
What can you
Nicaragua,
buy?
Rosary,
Nicaragua,
in
in
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, in
What can you buy for a
What can
penny?
you
Nicaragua,
A basket
in
full
Nicaragua,
of
Rosary.
in
What can you
what a
Nicaragua,
bag of earthenware,
in
What can you
Nicaragua,
buy?
rosary of
in
corn,
Nicaragua,
that a priest,
in Nicaragua,
A
in
rosary.
Nicaragua,
pennies,
in Nicaragua,
the strangest
Nicaragua,
music ever heard,
Nicaragua,
from the privileged
Nicaragua,
the clay
in Nicaragua,
and for good
in
measure,
Nicaragua,
give
in
you a
Nicaragua,
patriot's word
in
for a
Nicaragua,
nickel,
in Nicaragua,
Nicaragua,
in Nicaragua,
land of
in
mankind,
Nicaragua,
golden
in
mine,
Nicaragua, in
flowing
Nicaragua,
high,
in
a little
Nicaragua,
house with a
in
river
Nicaragua,
and a river
in
passing by.
Nicaragua, in Nicaragua,
A dirty
in
dog, a
Nicaragua,
greenish
in
leopard,
Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in Nicaragua, in
A
Nicaragua,
las gentes
in Nicaragua,
que
in
yo soy
Nicaragua,
tu
in
enemiga.
Nicaragua,
A bright
in
white
Nicaragua,
It's
in
not
Nicaragua, in 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 Nicaragua.
Se alza mis besos, no es tu
greenish
es mi voz, porque tu
hatred you
eres ropaje
robaje
y la
y la
esencia
esencia
soy yo
soy yo
y el más
y el más
profundo
profundo
abismo
abismo
se tiende
se tiende
entre las dos.
entre las dos.
Tú eres primera muñeca
Muñeca
de mentira,
de mentira
social
social
y yo
yo
viril destello
Viri, destello
de la humana.
And still, New York is my home.
Tú
I am ferociously loyal
miel
to
de
this acquired
cortesana
de cortesana
hipocresía,
hipocresía
because of New
yo no
York. I am a
que
foreigner
en todos
anywhere else.
dos
mis
Fierce
poemas
pride in the sense
desnudos
that assaulted us
desnudo
along the West Side Street.
el corazón
Marijuana and the smell of beer, the odor of dawn urine, and the savage
egoísta
mentality
yo no
yo no
descending
que en
upon us.
todo me lo juego
The speaker,
hacer
lo que soy yo,
speaker,
que soy
lo que soy yo,
from a
lo
speaker,
que soy yo,
from a speaker,
lo que soy yo, lo que soy yo,
from a
lo que
speaker,
soy yo,
from a
lo
speaker,
que soy yo,
from a speaker,
lo que soy yo,
from a speaker,
lo que soy yo, lo que soy yo, lo que soy yo,
from a speaker,
lo que soy yo, lo que soy yo, lo que soy yo.
speaker.
En Nicaragua.
So any questions? I don't, usually after performances, I don't say too much about it so that there's no about. It's just a sensibility. And as I mentioned before, the idea with this conduction is to kind of take poetic text and reimagine it, re-embody it. But that's all I'll say about that. Maybe do the poets have any, does the choir have anything to say about what you've done? Or do you want to, or just let it be the way it is?
Thank you.
I put them on the spot, that's okay. So this is actually a Q&A. So if anybody has questions, you know, connecting to the panel or to this, yes.
But many of you are scholars, and so I want to ask what are some of the main issues of leadership or institution that you see as scholars in academia? What stands out when I ask that question?
Leadership that gets in the way or just that leads?
Problems of leadership, problems of inclusion, I'm thinking of diversity, equity.
I mean, I'll try to answer in the least boring way and the most tied to poetry. I mean, one thing would be the very categories of you know, DEI, right, diversity and equity and inclusion as kind of managerial corporate logics that don't come from the communities they represent. So precisely thinking about the value of poetry and the value of art, right, is the kind of lived experience, the embodied, the untranslatable difference, right? So I like to quote Audre Lorde as a kind of anti-DEI thinker, right? So Lorde's idea was if we're not working from difference and we're not doing it from below, there is no transformation. So like the whole tokenistic, we have our token X that's appointed from above, right? And then we fight for the crumbs, right? Isn't really going to get it done. And I think her model is very much one that resonates, right? And in women of color feminism, and there's a couple of poets in the anthology, right? Ansaldua's there, right? Aurora Levins Morales. So I would say that, right? As opposed to rehabilitating DEI, right? Thinking what else can we do, counter institutions, right? What knowledges do our communities have? So that's a big problem I face at NYU, is people assuming that the higher ups have the knowledge already, right? And just need for us to implement, right, their vision, as opposed to thinking how can they learn, right, from the communities that they serve. And that's one reason I think poetry and the arts are so valuable.
The phrase, the untranslatable difference, is deep. Laura, do you have any?
I mean, what can I add to that? That was so eloquent. I mean, one of the greatest problems right now is that funding to hire scholars. We train a lot of PhDs, but unfortunately, most of the scholars of color are adjuncts. And that means very difficult survival and not having, I don't have a research budget. So I think there's this, we need to build our field, this is a part of building our field. And the way to do that is to have people aware that this culture, this tradition merits study and merits departments and programs and centers where we can talk to each other and meet and invite each other to speak. I mean, this is really where we're at Rutgers Newark.
I'd like to say that the performance was amazing. It's very spectral, and it had a sense of viscerality to feel like these voices intertwine. So at the same time, seeing you guys, all individual poets in their own right that are amazing, all of them are amazing established poets in New York, also intertwining at the same time. So I'd love to hear from the performers what it felt like in the process of putting this together and in the process of performing it.
I was gonna say, like as poets, as writers, a lot of us work alone, like in a silo, and so to be able to collaborate with other poets, it's a beautiful thing, and like listen to each other and hear each other, and work off of each other. So this was really brilliant, and it's a great opportunity for us as well to be inspired to continue writing.
Yeah, okay, grab me. But I just feel like it is ghostly. There's something really ghostly about it. It's like, and when we did it a month ago in front of Clemente, it was in the outdoors. It was harder to hear, but it was also the elements mixed with it, and it has a quality of like you're tapping into the mystical and the ancestors for sure, and it feels larger than you, and right, I'd never heard of like Salomón de la Selva. I was really fascinated by him, especially because of the Central America connection, and I'm a Central American poet, and I like calling him through the words is awesome. I just really like that aspect of the larger sense, but I just also, it's the community. It's the sense of not doing it alone, of changing poetry to me, that it's, not just like one person on a stage, that it's not all the ego sometimes involved in it, and that you can lose yourself in it, and you're not sure, where the sound is coming from at some point. It's that loss of ego that I think I really like about it.
I think for me, just being a part of a creative process with Edwin is always fun and challenging in a really beautiful way. In my own poetry, I tend to be very rhythmical by nature anyway, so I love this sort of new way of doing it, and doing it with different voices and even different languages. And as a Puerto Rican poet, to be a part of reading, Latin, Latin work, it's like the others have said about, it's like tapping into this part of myself that sometimes living in America can try to push you to forget who you are and where you come from. So it feels like a coming home, if that makes sense. It feels good in my soul. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. It's like, man, it's like tapping into like my grandmother, my great grandmothers, right? Like the ancestors. That's it. It just feels really good. I don't know how else to explain it. It just feels good, you know. That's it.
I just appreciate how every rehearsal is completely different. Every performance is completely different. I make sounds that I didn't even know that I had the capacity to make, and it's true. It feels good. It's a soulful thing. And honestly, when I fall into it, Edwin, and this is a question I think back to you, it's like, what? It's over already? Like, I feel like it could have gone on for like a half hour or something. That might be too much for the audience. I don't know, but I just fall into that kind of trance where the language is somewhere else, is beyond me. Like everyone else has said, it is a deeply spiritual encounter with language for me in collaboration. So thank you to all.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think poetry needs collectivity, right? And that it's a moment in time where we need to be working and thinking more collectively. And, the poet is often alone, right? And so to have these moments where you can be like a bigger body than yourself are so powerful. I mean, you just hear it as people talk down the row. It's surprising. And it's surprising how easy it is actually to do in some way. Like, you just fall into it and it happens.
There's one part of all this which I learned from Butch Morris is this ability to kind of embody each of you with trust, that it's okay to not know where you're going, and that's not taught. Like, the academy doesn't teach that, and how it speaks to my entry into poetry, which was not through the university but the street. And it speaks to the sense of wonder that is so important. Like, the imagination is a writer's tool, this arsenal that we have at our calling. And how to have a chance for that as a writer, working with other texts, but also for the audience to kind of like allow themselves to travel in places. There is kind of like this spiritual other, but even that's too hippie. It's more like this idea of allowing trust in my listening, and as a writer, allowing trust in what I'm thinking of, that I don't really know what this poem means to me right now, but it'll mean something later on, or it won't. It's just the idea of just letting it out of yourself. So I think conduction, which I learned from Butch, is this sense of finding sounds that you didn't know you had, but you have them. We all have them, and and this also speaks a little bit to the other in the panel discussion, the Latino-ness of like, what is my other? Where's my other in me and subsequently in the city? Like, we're talking about New York City Latinos, but also just the idea of like, where can I find myself, that sense of trust in not knowing? So.
Thanks for that, Edwin. I thought the way you were talking, I think previously about Butch, right, who I also loved, that was your neighbor, right?
It was in the East Village,
in the East Village. So that sense that also, that's a kind of counter-institutional space, right? Yeah. Space outside of the academy. And I also think of just the story of African Americans, right, in New York, and Latinos in New York. It's such a central part, right? And I think also just the kind of free jazz vibe of that. I feel like that, when you hear Coltrane do Ascension, right? It's like something is unfinished. We're not going to get there yet, but we're on the way, right? And so to me, reading Clemente's poem, right, that it's all about that promised land, right? We're still colonized, right? We're still in the struggle, but there's beauty ahead of us, right? And we're working our way there. So I think there's a beautiful way in which, for me, Butch, who I never met, but you did, becomes one of the ancestors that's sharing that with us. And I want to say also that's something that I know is important to you in your work. So the spiritual, right, to not let our kind of material.
Well, the something unfinished is
Absolutely,
key.
right? So letting the process take us somewhere, right, where we never thought we could go. So I just wanted to honor, right, the fact that also Butch, that the knowledges we get from Butch are also coming from outside of the institution, right, and reimagining this beautiful space for us.
And are we listening? No, are we allowing ourselves to listen to that? Yeah. Yes.
I found when I closed my eyes that it was totally different, and I can really focus on the piece. And I know it took a lot for each one of you to sit there and focus on your own role. So I thought that was special. It was different. It was that poetic license or something, but it was different. But yeah, it was nice. And I have one other comment. So I also went back to some old books I had because I wrote some poetry years ago. I was like, wow. And then this came up today. It was like crazy. But I find that when I read some of the stuff, I'm like, oh, I should have used another word. Does that happen to any of you? Like you want to go back and start changing the words? Like, I could have written a better poem. But yeah, so that's normal, right?
Part of it's owning your mistake, and also that it's never finished. That's okay. How do you guys deal with like knowing when to stop?
I think you feel it.
You feel it, yeah.
I feel like, well, for me, I've held on to poems since I'm a lot older than this age. Since I'm like, oh, thank you. Since I'm like 18, I have all my black and white notebooks, right, forever. And I've rewritten stuff sometimes like 15 years later. Like I've held on to it, and then, as we evolve, right, the way that we see perhaps a situation evolves, and then you write it from a deeper space maybe, so there will be different words available to you. Like I was just telling her, I changed a couple words in a poem when we were downstairs rehearsing today. Like it happens all the time, right? Like I think poetry and language is like a living, breathing thing, and it's always changing. So like if it changes, just allow it to change. It's fine. Right? And then for me, I feel it like in my heart that like that baby's done being birthed. Does that make sense? It's like, it's just a feeling you have that it's, you just feel it. That's all I can say, really.
The important thing is that you listen to your own heart.
I mean, I'll say for me, untranslatability, which I use a lot, is a big one. So I actually will do this. So when I'm not sure if I'm done with a piece, I'll try translating it into the other language, right? And then if I feel like I can't, I'm like, okay, then it's got to be in this language, and it can't become something else. It is what it is in its current form. And shout out also, I should say, to all the translators in the anthology, because that's one of the big, kind of fictions of doing an anthology like that, is there's actually the work of many, many, many translators, right, that we're working with and from, right? But I think one of the powers for me, and this happens so little, Spanish language writing in the US is so invisibilized, right? Even though it has this rich trajectory, right? Back to Martí and the US, right? So the chance to read these poems in Spanish, right? And to let them, be reimagined, right? For a wider readership feels like one of the really incredible contributions of this anthology. And of course, if you're in New York, you're used to hearing the ghosts of English and Spanish, right? And the gaps in between them, whether or not you know a word of Spanish, you have a sense of the physicality, right? Of what that beautiful vertigo feels like. And there are many Spanishes and many Englishes and many Spanglishes. So I think that's also part of what I feel like folks bring to it, right? Is their own, plurality of language experiences.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marsha, Eli. Thank you. Buy the book.
Yeah.